Good evening, dear friend. Come, settle yourself comfortably as the night gathers around us. The world outside has grown quiet, and this is the perfect time for us to journey together through history, through a time when humanity discovered something profound and terrifying, a power that would shape the world for generations. Tonight, we'll walk slowly through the story of the atomic standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, understanding how two nations came to possess weapons capable of ending civilization, and how the world learned to live under that shadow. Let the day's worries fade away as we explore this history together, calmly and gently, allowing the story to carry you toward peaceful rest. You find yourself standing in the New Mexico desert on a warm summer night in July 1945. The war in Europe has ended just weeks ago, and the war against Japan continues in the Pacific. Above you, the stars shine with extraordinary clarity in the dry desert air. The landscape around you is empty, vast, ancient. For miles in every direction, there is nothing but sand and scrub brush and distant mountains silhouetted against the night sky. You're about 20 miles from a place called Alamordo, in a location the scientists have codenamed Trinity. Something unprecedented is about to happen here. Something that will change the course of human history forever. In the darkness, you can see a steel tower rising 100 feet into the air. Atop this tower sits a device that looks almost comical, a sphere bristling with cables and detonators, carefully assembled over recent days by scientists and technicians who have worked in absolute secrecy for years. This device contains a few pounds of plutonium, a man-made element that doesn't exist in nature, created in massive reactors built specifically for this purpose. The plutonium is surrounded by precisely shaped conventional explosives designed to compress it with perfect symmetry. When these explosives detonate, they will squeeze the plutonium so tightly that its atoms will begin splitting apart, releasing energy according to Einstein's famous equation. This is the world's first atomic bomb, and in moments, it will be tested. You're far enough away to be safe, watching from a bunker with scientists who have spent years developing this weapon. Among them is Robert Oppenheimer, the brilliant physicist who has led the Manhattan Project, the vast secret program to build the atomic bomb. Oppenheimer is thin, intellectual, a man who reads ancient Sanskrit texts for relaxation and who has assembled the greatest collection of scientific minds America could gather. Near him are other scientists whose names will become famous: Enrico Fermi, Edward Teller, Hans Bethe. They're tense, uncertain whether this test will succeed or fail, whether the bomb will work as their calculations predict or whether it might not work at all. Some have even worried, briefly, whether the explosion might ignite the atmosphere itself, though their calculations have assured them this is impossible. The countdown reaches zero just before 5:30 in the morning. For a fraction of a second, nothing seems to happen. Then the darkness is suddenly, violently replaced by light brighter than 1,000 suns, light so intense that you must turn away even though you're wearing dark goggles. The light is white, then golden, then every color, illuminating the desert as if day has come instantly. The heat hits you even at this distance, a wave of warmth on your face. The tower where the bomb sat simply vanishes, vaporized in that first instant. A fireball forms, rising upward, expanding, churning with energy. It grows into a mushroom shape, the hot gases rising, cooler air rushing in at the bottom, creating the distinctive form that will become the signature of atomic explosions. The cloud rises thousands of feet into the air, glowing with internal fire. Then, after what seems like an eternity but is really less than a minute, the sound reaches you. It's not a simple bang but a rolling, complex roar that seems to come from everywhere at once. The ground shakes beneath your feet. Windows in buildings hundreds of miles away will rattle. The explosion has released energy equivalent to about 20,000 tons of TNT, more destructive power than could be delivered by any conventional bombing raid, all released in a fraction of a second from a device small enough to fit in a single bomb casing. In the bunker, you see Oppenheimer's face in the dim light. He's watching the mushroom cloud rise, and his expression is complex, mixing triumph with something darker, something like horror. Later, he will say that a line from Hindu scripture came to him at that moment, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The scientists around him are celebrating, shaking hands, excited that their calculations were correct, that years of work have culminated in this success. But underneath the excitement, there's an awareness that they have opened a door that can never be closed, that they have given humanity a power that might one day destroy it. The Trinity test remained secret for weeks. The war continues in the Pacific. American forces are preparing for an invasion of Japan, an invasion that military planners expect will cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and perhaps millions of Japanese casualties. The Japanese military has shown itself willing to fight to the last man, organizing civilians for defense, preparing for a final battle on the home islands. President Harry Truman, who became president only months earlier after Franklin Roosevelt's death, faces a terrible decision. He has been informed of the Manhattan Project and the successful Trinity test. He now has a weapon that might end the war quickly, but using it will mean unleashing atomic destruction on a city, killing tens of thousands of civilians in an instant. After consulting with his advisors, Truman decides to use the bomb. The alternatives, he is told, are worse. On August 6, 1945, you find yourself flying high above the Japanese city of Hiroshima in the early morning. You're in a B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets. In the bomb bay is a uranium bomb nicknamed Little Boy. Hiroshima is a city of about 350,000 people, a port city with military facilities but also residential neighborhoods, schools, hospitals. The morning is clear, perfect weather for the bombing mission. At 8:15 local time, the bomb bay doors open and Little Boy falls away from the plane. The bomber immediately banks hard to get away from the blast zone. The bomb falls for about 45 seconds, then detonates about 2,000 feet above the city, the height calculated to maximize destruction across the widest area. From your distance, you see the flash, brilliantly bright even through the goggles every crew member is wearing. Then the mushroom cloud begins to form, rising from the heart of Hiroshima. Beneath that cloud, in a radius of about a mile from the detonation point, nearly everything has been destroyed. Buildings have been flattened, reduced to rubble. The heat has ignited fires that will merge into a firestorm. Tens of thousands of people have been killed instantly, vaporized by the heat or crushed by the blast wave. Tens of thousands more are injured, many mortally, suffering burns and radiation exposure that will kill them in the coming days and weeks. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb, this one made of plutonium and nicknamed Fat Man, is dropped on Nagasaki after the primary target of Kokura is obscured by clouds. Nagasaki's destruction is similar, though the city's hilly terrain limits the bomb's effect somewhat compared to Hiroshima. About 70,000 people died there, added to the 70,000 who died at Hiroshima in the first moments, and the many thousands more who will die later from injuries and radiation sickness. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito announces Japan's surrender and World War II ends. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki accomplished their immediate purpose. The war ends without an invasion, without the massive casualties that would have resulted from fighting on the Japanese home islands. But the bombings also introduce the world to a new kind of warfare, one where a single bomb delivered by a single plane can destroy an entire city. The images from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the photographs of flattened landscapes, the accounts of survivors with terrible burns, the reports of a mysterious radiation sickness that kills people who seem to survive the initial blast, all of this creates a new awareness that humanity now possesses weapons of unprecedented destructive power. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the United States is the only nation with atomic weapons. The Manhattan Project remains somewhat secret. The world knows atomic bombs were used, but the details of how they work and how to build them remain classified. The United States has perhaps a dozen atomic bombs in its arsenal by late 1945, and it's building more. American leaders believe they have a significant military advantage, a monopoly on this powerful new technology. Some suggest that this monopoly should be used to establish a world government or at least an international authority to control atomic energy. Others believe the monopoly should be maintained for as long as possible to preserve American military superiority. Scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project have mixed feelings about what they've created. Some, like Leo Szilard, had opposed using the bomb on Japanese cities without warning, preferring a demonstration on an uninhabited island. Others believed the bomb was necessary to end the war quickly. Many now become advocates for international control of atomic energy, arguing that no single nation should possess such weapons, that humanity needs to find a way to eliminate them entirely or at least prevent their spread. Organizations like the Federation of American Scientists formed to promote peaceful uses of atomic energy and to advocate for arms control. But geopolitical realities are already creating the conditions for an atomic arms race. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union is fracturing. Tensions are rising over the future of Germany, over Soviet control of Eastern Europe, over competing visions of how the post-war world should be organized. American leaders increasingly see the Soviet Union as a potential adversary, and the atomic monopoly is viewed as a crucial military advantage in this emerging competition. The Soviets, for their part, feel threatened by American possession of atomic weapons. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, understands that American atomic bombs could be used to intimidate the Soviet Union, to prevent Soviet expansion, or even to attack Soviet cities. He is determined that the Soviet Union must have its own atomic weapons to balance American power. The stage is being set for a decades-long competition, a race to build ever more powerful nuclear weapons, a standoff where two nations would come to possess the capability to destroy human civilization. As the world transitions from World War to Cold War, from conventional warfare to the atomic age, you can sense the profound change taking place. The nature of conflict between great powers has been fundamentally transformed. War between nations with atomic weapons would be different from all previous wars, potentially catastrophic in ways that are difficult to even imagine. As you rest tonight, consider how this moment in history, these two explosions over Japanese cities in August 1945, opened a new chapter in human experience. The power that had been contained in the heart of the atom was now available to nations, and that power would shape international relations, military strategy, and daily life for generations to come. The atomic age had begun, and the world would never be quite the same. The Soviet Union in 1945 is a nation that has suffered enormously during World War II. You walk slowly through the ruins of cities that were once vibrant centers of life, now reduced to shells and rubble. 27 million Soviet citizens have died in the war, more than any other nation. Entire cities have been destroyed. Factories have been demolished. Farms have been devastated. The victory over Nazi Germany came at a price almost impossible to comprehend. Now, as the war ends, the Soviet people face the enormous task of rebuilding everything that was lost. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, is a man who rules through fear and absolute control. He's paranoid, suspicious, brutal, but he's also calculating and strategic. When he learns of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, he understands immediately that this changes everything. The Soviet Union, despite its enormous army and its victory over Germany, is now at a fundamental disadvantage. The United States has a weapon that could threaten Soviet cities, could potentially destroy the Soviet Union without ever sending ground troops across Soviet borders. Stalin cannot allow this imbalance to continue. Even before Hiroshima, Stalin had known about American efforts to build an atomic bomb. Soviet intelligence services had been remarkably successful at penetrating the Manhattan Project. You find yourself in a quiet office in Moscow where Soviet intelligence officers are reviewing reports from agents in America. These agents, motivated by various reasons including communist ideology and belief that no single nation should monopolize such a powerful weapon, have been passing information about the American bomb program to the Soviets since 1942. Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist working at Los Alamos, provides detailed technical information about bomb design. Theodore Hall, a young American physicist, also passes secrets. David Greenglass, a machinist working at Los Alamos, provides information through his handler, Julius Rosenberg. There are others as well, forming a network that gives the Soviets significant insight into how atomic bombs work. The information from these spies is valuable, but it's not sufficient by itself. Building an atomic bomb requires enormous industrial infrastructure, scientific expertise, and resources. The Soviet Union must develop its own program, must organize scientists and engineers, must build reactors to produce plutonium, must construct factories to process uranium and manufacture bomb components. This will be an enormous undertaking for a nation still recovering from devastating war. Stalin places the Soviet atomic bomb project under the control of Lavrentiy Beria, the head of the secret police and one of Stalin's most trusted and most feared lieutenants. Beria is ruthless, a man who has overseen purges and executions, who rules through terror. But he's also efficient and capable of organizing large projects. Beria recruits Igor Kurchatov, a brilliant physicist, to be the scientific director of the bomb program. Kurchatov is in his early 40s, a man with a characteristic bushy beard, deeply committed to science, and now tasked with one of the most important projects in Soviet history. You follow Kurchatov as he travels to Azama 16, a secret city built specifically for the atomic bomb program. This city doesn't appear on any maps. It's located in the Russian countryside, surrounded by security fences and guard towers. Everyone who lives and works here is under constant surveillance. The penalty for discussing the work with anyone outside the program is severe, potentially including execution. The scientists and engineers who work at Azama 16 are given better living conditions than most Soviets, better food, better housing, as incentive and reward for their work. But they're also prisoners of sorts, unable to leave, unable to communicate freely with the outside world. The work proceeds slowly at first. Soviet scientists must solve the same technical problems that American scientists solved during the Manhattan Project. They must determine the critical mass of uranium or plutonium needed for a sustained chain reaction. They must design explosives that will compress the plutonium core with perfect symmetry. They must build reactors to produce plutonium and develop the complex chemistry needed to separate plutonium from irradiated uranium. The information from spies helps, providing shortcuts, confirming that certain approaches will work, eliminating dead ends. But the actual construction and testing still requires Soviet scientists and engineers to do the difficult work themselves. By 1949, the Soviet program is ready to test its first atomic bomb. The test is scheduled for late August at a remote site in Kazakhstan called Semipalatinsk. The device, code-named First Lightning, is similar in design to the American Fat Man bomb that destroyed Nagasaki. The similarity is not coincidental. The Soviets have used the stolen information to replicate an American design that is known to work, reducing the risk of failure in this crucial first test. The Soviet leadership cannot afford a failure. Stalin needs to demonstrate that the Soviet Union has atomic capability, needs to end the American monopoly as quickly as possible. On August 29, 1949, just before dawn, you stand in the Kazakhstan steppe, far from the test site but with a view toward the tower where First Lightning waits. The landscape here is flat, empty, a place of few people and harsh climate. The countdown proceeds. At the designated moment, the device detonates. The familiar mushroom cloud rises into the morning sky, visible for miles. The test is successful. The Soviet Union has become the second nation to possess atomic weapons, just 4 years after the American Trinity test. Stalin receives the news with satisfaction. The atomic monopoly is broken. The balance of power has shifted. The Americans can no longer threaten the Soviet Union with atomic weapons without facing the possibility of atomic retaliation. The Soviet test is kept secret initially, but American intelligence quickly detects it. The United States has deployed aircraft equipped with filters to collect air samples, and these aircraft detect radioactive particles in the atmosphere that could only have come from an atomic explosion. By September, American leaders know that the Soviet Union has tested an atomic bomb years earlier than American intelligence had predicted. The news shocks American leaders and the American public. The assumption had been that the Soviet Union, technologically backward and devastated by the war, would need a decade or more to develop atomic weapons. The fact that they've succeeded in only 4 years suggests either that Soviet science is more advanced than believed, or that Soviet espionage has been remarkably effective, or both. The comfortable period of American atomic monopoly is over. The atomic age is about to become much more complicated and dangerous. You find yourself in Washington in the fall of 1949, observing as American officials debate how to respond to the Soviet atomic test. Some argue for accelerating American atomic bomb production, building a larger arsenal to maintain superiority in numbers if not in exclusivity. Others propose developing even more powerful weapons, taking the next step beyond atomic bombs. Still others advocate for intensified efforts at international control, suggesting that now, with 2 nations possessing atomic weapons, is the time to pursue serious arms control negotiations before the situation deteriorates further. President Truman faces a difficult decision. The revelation of Soviet espionage, which is being uncovered through investigations by the FBI and other agencies, creates political pressure to respond forcefully, to demonstrate that America will not accept parity with the Soviet Union. The domestic political climate is becoming increasingly anti-communist. Senator Joseph McCarthy will soon begin his infamous hearings, claiming that communists have infiltrated the American government. In this atmosphere, appearing weak on defense is politically dangerous. At the same time, American scientists and military planners are already working on the next generation of nuclear weapons. During the Manhattan Project, scientists had theorized about fusion weapons, bombs that would use the energy from an atomic explosion to trigger fusion of hydrogen atoms, releasing far more energy than fission alone. These thermonuclear weapons, or hydrogen bombs, would be potentially hundreds of times more powerful than the fission bombs dropped on Japan. Some scientists, including Oppenheimer, have moral reservations about developing such weapons, questioning whether there's any legitimate military use for bombs that would be so enormously destructive. But others, particularly Edward Teller, who has been advocating for fusion weapons since the 1940s, argue that the United States must pursue this technology, especially now that the Soviets have atomic bombs. In January 1950, Truman announces that the United States will proceed with development of the hydrogen bomb. The decision is made partly in response to the Soviet atomic test, partly due to political pressure, and partly from the logic that if such weapons are possible, America must develop them first. The arms race is about to accelerate dramatically. Back in the Soviet Union, Kurchatov and his team are not resting on their achievement. They're already working on improved bomb designs, on ways to make weapons smaller and more efficient, on developing the means to deliver atomic bombs to targets. The Soviet Air Force needs aircraft capable of flying to American cities and returning, which is challenging given the vast distances involved in American air defenses. Soviet scientists are also beginning work on their own hydrogen bomb program, aware that the Americans are pursuing this technology and determined not to fall behind. The Soviet atomic bomb project transforms the Soviet Union's international position. In the years immediately after World War II, when only America had atomic weapons, Soviet foreign policy had to be cautious, aware that Stalin's expansionist ambitions in Europe and Asia could be checked by the threat of atomic attack. Now, with Soviet atomic capability, Stalin can be more assertive. The balance of power has shifted from American monopoly toward a more equal and more dangerous standoff. For ordinary Soviet citizens, the successful test of first lightning is a source of national pride, though most know few details about the bomb or the program that created it. The Soviet government announces the test eventually, portraying it as a great achievement of Soviet science and a demonstration of Soviet power. The scientists and engineers who built the bomb receive honors and awards, though always in secret since the details of the program remain classified. Kurchatov becomes a hero of the Soviet Union, though few outside the scientific community know his name or his work. As you rest and reflect on this segment of history, consider how quickly the atomic monopoly ended, how rapidly the technology spread despite efforts to keep it secret. The Soviet Union, emerging from the devastation of World War II, managed in just 4 years to develop one of the most complex technologies humans had ever created. The achievement owed something to espionage, but it also reflected genuine Soviet scientific and engineering capability. Two nations now possessed atomic weapons. The standoff was beginning. The early 1950s bring a new urgency to nuclear weapons development. You find yourself observing a world that is moving from having just a few atomic bombs to building arsenals with hundreds, then thousands of nuclear weapons. This acceleration is driven by technological advances, by strategic calculations, and by the deepening Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Each advance by one side prompts a response from the other. Each new weapon type or delivery method creates pressure to match it. The arms race has its own momentum, a logic that drives both nations to build ever more weapons even as the destructive power already accumulated becomes difficult to comprehend. In the United States, atomic bomb production increases dramatically after the Soviet test. The Atomic Energy Commission, the civilian agency responsible for nuclear weapons development and production, expands its facilities. New reactors are built to produce more plutonium. Uranium enrichment plants are expanded to produce more weapon-grade uranium. The number of bombs in the American arsenal grows from perhaps a few hundred in 1950 to several thousand by the mid-1950s. Each bomb represents an enormous investment in scientific knowledge, industrial capacity, and rare materials. You visit Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where vast facilities separate uranium isotopes to produce the enriched uranium needed for bombs. The process is extraordinarily energy-intensive, requiring enormous amounts of electricity to run the centrifuges and gaseous diffusion equipment. You see Hanford, Washington, where plutonium production reactors line the Columbia River, using its water for cooling. These facilities employ tens of thousands of workers, creating entire communities devoted to nuclear weapons production. The workers know they're supporting national defense, though many don't know the exact purpose of their work. The specific process is kept secret even from those who operate the equipment. The Soviet Union is similarly expanding its nuclear weapons production. Soviet reactors and enrichment facilities grow in number and size. The city of Chelyabinsk becomes a major center of plutonium production, its reactors working constantly, its facilities growing to employ thousands. Like the American facilities, the Soviet nuclear complex is vast, consuming enormous resources from an economy still recovering from war damage. But Stalin considers this investment essential. The Soviet Union cannot allow America to maintain a significant numerical advantage in nuclear weapons. Both nations are also developing better delivery methods. The atomic bombs of the late 1940s are large, heavy devices, difficult to transport and requiring large aircraft to carry them. Through the early 1950s, weapon designs are refined, made smaller and lighter. This makes them easier to deliver and allows development of nuclear artillery shells and nuclear warheads for missiles. The efficiency of weapons improves as well, producing more explosive yield for the same amount of fissile material, making each bomb more destructive. Aircraft capable of delivering atomic bombs are a major focus of development. The United States builds the B-36, an enormous bomber with 6 propeller engines and 4 jet engines capable of flying intercontinental distances. Later comes the B-52 Stratofortress, a jet bomber that will remain in service for decades, capable of carrying multiple nuclear weapons and flying to the Soviet Union and back. These aircraft are complemented by overseas bases where American bombers can be stationed closer to Soviet targets, reducing the distance they need to fly. The Soviet Union develops its own strategic bombers, including the Tu-95, a turboprop aircraft with intercontinental range. But the Soviets face geographic challenges. The United States is surrounded by oceans and friendly neighbors, making it difficult for Soviet bombers to reach American cities. The Soviet Union has American bases along its periphery, in Europe, in Turkey, in Japan, placing American nuclear weapons much closer to Soviet territory. This geographic asymmetry means that American bombers can reach Soviet targets more easily than Soviet bombers can reach American targets, creating a strategic imbalance that the Soviets work to address through various means. As the arsenals grow and delivery methods improve, military strategists in both nations are developing doctrines for how nuclear weapons would actually be used in war. You sit in on meetings in the Pentagon where generals and civilian defense officials debate nuclear strategy. Some argue that nuclear weapons are so destructive that they can only serve as a deterrent, that their purpose is to prevent war by threatening unacceptable retaliation if attacked. Others envision actually fighting and winning a nuclear war, developing detailed plans for strikes against military targets, industrial facilities, cities. The Strategic Air Command, or SAC, becomes the primary American organization for nuclear weapons delivery. Led by General Curtis LeMay, a veteran of the strategic bombing campaigns against Germany and Japan, SAC maintains bombers on constant alert, some always in the air, ready to launch attacks if ordered. SAC develops elaborate war plans specifying which Soviet cities and military targets would be struck, in what order, with how many weapons. These plans evolve as the arsenal grows, as intelligence about Soviet targets improves, as assumptions about Soviet capabilities change. The Soviet Union develops its own strategic forces, though less is publicly known about their planning and organization during this period. Soviet military doctrine emphasizes combined arms operations, the coordination of different military branches. Nuclear weapons are integrated into this framework, seen as extremely powerful but not fundamentally different from other weapons. Soviet planners developed scenarios for nuclear war in Europe, imagining how tactical nuclear weapons might be used to destroy NATO military formations and how strategic nuclear weapons might be used against American bases and eventually American cities. The Korean War, which begins in June 1950 when North Korea invades South Korea, creates new urgency around nuclear weapons. The United States, fighting under United Nations authorization to defend South Korea, considers using atomic bombs against North Korean and Chinese forces. General MacArthur, commanding UN forces, requests authorization to use atomic bombs against Chinese supply lines and military concentrations. President Truman refuses, concerned that using atomic weapons in Korea might trigger Soviet intervention or even nuclear war. Truman eventually relieves MacArthur of command, partly due to MacArthur's public advocacy for nuclear weapons use. The incident illustrates that even as arsenals grow, American leaders are cautious about actually using nuclear weapons, aware that doing so might escalate beyond control. You watch as both nations begin conducting atmospheric nuclear tests, explosions in the open air that send radioactive fallout into the atmosphere. The United States conducts tests in Nevada, where mushroom clouds are visible from Las Vegas, about 70 miles away. Tourists sometimes gather to watch the distant explosions, treating them as entertainment, not fully understanding the danger posed by radioactive fallout. The military conducts exercises where soldiers are deliberately positioned near test explosions to practice advancing through radioactive terrain, exposing thousands of service members to radiation without adequate protection or understanding of long-term health effects. The Soviet Union conducts its tests in Kazakhstan and in the Arctic, in remote locations far from population centers, though fallout from these tests still exposes nearby populations to radiation. Neither nation yet understands fully the health consequences of atmospheric testing, the way radioactive particles spread through the atmosphere, falling back to Earth over vast distances, contaminating soil and water, entering the food chain. Studies will eventually show increased cancer rates in populations downwind of test sites, but in the early 1950s, this danger is not yet widely recognized. Through the early and mid-1950s, the nuclear arsenals continue growing. The United States has perhaps 1,000 nuclear weapons by 1953, 4,000 by 1956. The Soviet Union builds its arsenal more slowly, having started later and having a less developed industrial base, but is still accumulating hundreds and eventually thousands of weapons. These numbers begin to seem abstract. What does it mean to have 4,000 nuclear weapons? How many cities are there to destroy? How many times can you destroy the same target? The numbers grow beyond any rational military requirement, driven partly by uncertainty about how many weapons would actually reach their targets in war, partly by bureaucratic momentum as institutions devoted to weapons production continue expanding, and partly by the logic of deterrence, which suggests that having more weapons than the adversary provides some psychological or strategic advantage. Civilian scientists, some of the same people who helped develop atomic bombs during World War II, become increasingly concerned about the arms race. Organizations like the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists begin publishing analyses of nuclear policy, questioning whether the arms race makes anyone safer. The Bulletin creates the Doomsday Clock, a symbolic clock face where midnight represents nuclear war. The clock's hands move closer to or farther from midnight based on the editor's assessment of nuclear danger. Through the early 1950s, the clock moves closer to midnight, reflecting the accelerating arms race and the absence of progress on arms control. Some scientists advocate for international control of atomic energy, proposing that all nuclear weapons be placed under United Nations authority, that no individual nation should possess them. But the Cold War political climate makes such proposals impractical. Neither the United States nor the Soviet Union is willing to surrender its weapons or place them under international control. Mutual suspicion runs too deep. The ideological divide between capitalism and communism seems unbridgeable. Each side views the other as an existential threat, and nuclear weapons are seen as essential to deterring that threat. As you reflect on this period of rapid nuclear buildup, consider how quickly the situation escalated from a few weapons to thousands. In just a few years, enough destructive power was created to threaten human civilization. The arms race had its own logic and momentum, driven by technology, strategy, fear, and bureaucratic inertia. Two nations, locked in competition, were accumulating arsenals that neither could fully control and that both would come to fear. The nuclear standoff was deepening. The atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the bombs built in the late 1940s and early 1950s, are fission weapons. They work by splitting heavy atoms like uranium or plutonium, releasing energy according to Einstein's equation. These fission weapons are enormously destructive, but there's a theoretical limit to how powerful they can be. The critical mass required for a chain reaction and the practical difficulties of assembling large amounts of fissile material mean that pure fission bombs generally have yields measured in tens of kilotons, equivalent to tens of thousands of tons of conventional explosives. But scientists on both sides have known since the 1940s that a much more powerful type of weapon is theoretically possible. Fusion weapons, also called thermonuclear weapons or hydrogen bombs, would use the extreme heat and pressure from a fission explosion to trigger fusion reactions, forcing hydrogen isotopes to combine into helium and releasing far more energy than fission alone. These fusion weapons would have no practical upper limit on their yield. They could be made as powerful as desired, with yields measured not in kilotons but in megatons, millions of tons of TNT equivalent. You find yourself at Eniwetok Atoll in the Pacific Ocean in November 1952. This remote coral atoll has been cleared of its native inhabitants and converted into a nuclear test site. The United States is about to test Ivy Mike, the world's first true thermonuclear device. Ivy Mike is not a deliverable weapon but rather a physics experiment, a device designed to prove that fusion can be achieved and to gather data about how it works. The device is enormous, a 3-story building housing cryogenic equipment to maintain the liquid deuterium fuel at extremely low temperatures. It weighs over 80 tons. This is not something that could be loaded onto an aircraft and dropped on a target. But if the test succeeds, it will demonstrate that fusion is possible, that weapons with yields of many megatons can be built. The test is scheduled for early morning. You're many miles away on a ship equipped with instruments to measure the explosion. At the designated time, the device is detonated. The explosion is beyond anything previously witnessed. The fireball alone is several miles across, far larger than any fission bomb. The mushroom cloud rises nearly 20 miles into the stratosphere. The island where the device was placed simply ceases to exist, vaporized entirely, leaving a crater in the ocean floor. The yield is measured at over 10 megatons, about 500 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. In a single explosion, the United States has demonstrated the ability to destroy an entire city, not just damage it but obliterate it completely. The success of Ivy Mike confirms American leadership in nuclear weapons technology and creates pressure for the Soviet Union to match this achievement. Soviet scientists, led by Andrei Sakharov, have been working on their own fusion weapon designs. Sakharov is a brilliant young physicist, just 30 years old, who will later become famous as a human rights activist and dissident, but in the early 1950s, he's devoted to giving the Soviet Union thermonuclear capability. The Soviet approach is somewhat different from the American one. Where Ivy Mike used liquid deuterium that required cryogenic cooling, the Soviet design uses lithium deuteride, a solid material that's easier to handle and could actually be made into a deliverable weapon. In August 1953, less than a year after Ivy Mike, the Soviet Union tests its first fusion weapon, codenamed Joe by American intelligence. This device has a yield of about 400 kilotons, much less than Ivy Mike, but still far more powerful than any pure fission bomb. More importantly, the Soviet device uses a design that can be weaponized, that can be made into a bomb that aircraft can actually carry. In the race to develop deliverable hydrogen bombs, the Soviets have actually leapfrogged ahead of the Americans despite testing their first thermonuclear device second. The United States quickly develops its own deliverable hydrogen bomb design. In March 1954, the Castle Bravo test in the Pacific produces a yield of 15 megatons, the largest nuclear explosion ever conducted by the United States. The test goes badly in several ways. The yield is more than twice what was expected due to unexpected fusion of lithium-7 in the weapon's fuel. The larger-than-expected explosion and shifting wind spread radioactive fallout over a much wider area than planned. The crew of a Japanese fishing boat, the Lucky Dragon, is exposed to heavy fallout about 80 miles from the test site, outside what was supposed to be the danger zone. One crew member dies from radiation sickness. Marshall Islanders living on atolls downwind are also exposed and must be evacuated. The incident creates an international controversy and raises public awareness of the dangers of radioactive fallout from nuclear tests. Despite these concerns, both nations continue testing hydrogen bombs through the 1950s. The weapons become smaller and more efficient, easier to deliver. Yields increase. The Soviet Union tests a weapon with a yield of about 3 megatons, then 5, then larger. The designs are refined, improved, made more reliable. By the late 1950s, both nations have operational hydrogen bombs in their arsenals, weapons that can be carried by aircraft and dropped on targets with yields of several megatons each. The advent of thermonuclear weapons changes the nature of nuclear strategy. With fission weapons in the kiloton range, it might take dozens or hundreds of bombs to destroy all major enemy cities and military targets. Such an attack would be devastating but conceivable to plan and execute. But hydrogen bombs with megaton yields mean that fewer weapons can cause much more destruction. A single hydrogen bomb can destroy even the largest city. The planning for nuclear war becomes increasingly abstract, involving calculations of casualties that exceed anything in previous human experience. You sit in on a briefing where military planners discuss scenarios for nuclear war. The charts show casualty estimates in the tens of millions, the hundreds of millions. Soviet cities would be destroyed. American cities would be destroyed. Radioactive fallout would spread across continents, contaminating vast areas, making them uninhabitable for years. Even without direct hits, countries would face agricultural collapse, economic breakdown, potential starvation of surviving populations. The planners discuss these scenarios in calm, professional tones, using euphemisms like collateral damage and acceptable losses, trying to make the unthinkable seem rational and plannable. The reality is that a full-scale nuclear exchange with hydrogen bombs would be an unprecedented catastrophe. Scientists begin publishing studies of nuclear winter, the theory that massive fires from nuclear explosions would inject enormous amounts of smoke and soot into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight, causing global temperatures to drop dramatically, potentially destroying agriculture worldwide and leading to mass starvation even in countries not directly attacked. These studies won't be published until the 1980s, but the basic idea that nuclear war would have global climate effects is already emerging in the 1950s from fallout studies and atmospheric science. The hydrogen bomb also raises moral and philosophical questions. Albert Einstein, whose famous equation underlies nuclear weapons, becomes a vocal advocate for nuclear disarmament. He works with Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher and mathematician, to issue the Russell-Einstein Manifesto in 1955, calling on world leaders to seek peaceful resolutions to conflicts and to recognize that nuclear war would likely mean the end of human civilization. The manifesto is signed by prominent scientists from various countries. It calls for a new way of thinking, arguing that humanity must abandon war itself in the nuclear age because the alternative is collective suicide. But the arms race continues regardless. Both nations develop miniaturized warheads that can be delivered by missiles rather than requiring large aircraft. Tactical nuclear weapons are developed, smaller bombs designed for battlefield use against military formations. Nuclear depth charges are created for anti-submarine warfare. Nuclear artillery shells are manufactured. Nuclear mines are designed to destroy bridges or tunnels. Nuclear weapons proliferate into every conceivable military role, as if every problem has a nuclear solution. The arsenals continue growing past any rational need, accumulating thousands of weapons, then tens of thousands. International efforts at arms control make little progress during the 1950s. The United Nations establishes various committees to discuss nuclear disarmament, but these talks go nowhere. The United States proposes the Baruch Plan, which would place all nuclear weapons under international control, but the Soviets reject it as a scheme to preserve American advantage. The Soviets make their own proposals for complete nuclear disarmament, but the Americans view these as propaganda, as unrealistic proposals that the Soviets know cannot be accepted. Neither side trusts the other enough to make meaningful concessions. The arms race continues. As you rest and reflect on this escalation from atomic to thermonuclear weapons, consider how the destructive power available to humans increased by orders of magnitude in just a few years. The hydrogen bomb was not just a bigger atomic bomb, but a qualitatively different weapon, one that made the complete destruction of civilization a real possibility. Two nations possessed weapons that could, if used, end modern life as we know it. And yet both nations continued building more weapons, refining them, making them more efficient, accumulating arsenals that dwarfed any military purpose. The logic of the arms race had taken on a life of its own. The nuclear arms race was not just an abstraction, not just something that happened in government offices and military laboratories. For ordinary people living in the United States and the Soviet Union during the 1950s and 1960s, the threat of nuclear war was part of daily life, a background anxiety that shaped culture, politics, and personal decisions. You find yourself in an American suburb in the mid-1950s, observing how families are trying to understand and prepare for the possibility of nuclear attack. The civil defense authorities distribute pamphlets and produce films explaining what to do in case of nuclear attack. These materials attempt to make nuclear war seem survivable, to give people a sense that they can protect themselves and their families through proper preparation. You watch a film being shown in schools, a cartoon featuring Bert the Turtle, who teaches children to duck and cover if they see a nuclear flash. The film shows children hiding under desks, covering their heads, as if this would provide meaningful protection against an atomic blast. The reality is that ducking under a desk might protect against flying glass or debris from a distant explosion, but it would do nothing against the heat and blast wave from a nearby nuclear explosion. Some families take civil defense more seriously, building fallout shelters in their basements or backyards. These shelters are reinforced rooms stocked with food, water, medical supplies, and other necessities to allow a family to survive for 2 weeks underground while radioactive fallout decays to safer levels. The government publishes plans for building shelters. Magazines run articles about shelter design. A small industry develops around shelter construction and supplies. Some families spend thousands of dollars building elaborate shelters, installing air filtration systems, stockpiling provisions, preparing for nuclear war with the same practical mindset they might apply to any other household project. But shelter ownership raises difficult moral questions that are openly debated in magazines and churches. If nuclear war comes, if fallout is contaminating everything outside, what should you do if neighbors who didn't build shelters come knocking, begging for safety? Do you let them in, potentially exhausting your supplies? Do you turn them away, perhaps at gunpoint, to save your own family? These questions are discussed with surprising directness in the 1950s. Some families install locks on their shelter doors. Some keep firearms in their shelters. The nuclear threat is creating a strange paranoia, where neighbors might become enemies in the aftermath of attack. In Soviet cities, civil defense takes a somewhat different form. The government builds extensive shelter systems, particularly in Moscow and other major cities, creating underground spaces that can hold large numbers of people. Some of these shelters are in metro stations, which are built deep underground partly for civil defense purposes. Factories and schools conduct drills, practicing evacuation to shelters. Soviet civil defense emphasizes collective rather than individual preparation, the idea that the state will protect its people through organized response rather than relying on individual family shelters. Schools in both countries conduct drills. You watch as American children file quietly into hallways or crouch under desks when the alert sounds, practicing what they would do if nuclear attack came during school hours. Teachers try to make this seem routine, not frightening, but the children understand at some level that this is different from a fire drill. Soviet children similarly practice going to shelters, filing into basements or metro stations, learning to follow instructions in case of attack. For a generation of children growing up in the 1950s and 1960s, nuclear war preparedness is just part of education, as normal as arithmetic or reading. The public is also educated about the effects of nuclear weapons through government publications that attempt to be informative without being panic-inducing. These materials explain the immediate effects, the blinding flash, the heat wave that can cause third-degree burns miles from the explosion, the blast wave that can collapse buildings and hurl debris at lethal speeds, the initial burst of radiation that can sicken or kill those close to the explosion. Then there's the fallout. Radioactive particles sucked up into the mushroom cloud and then falling back to Earth over hours and days, contaminating soil and water, making areas uninhabitable. The fallout danger means that surviving the initial explosion is not enough. People must shelter for days or weeks until the radiation decays to safer levels. But there are things these official materials don't emphasize, facts that would be too frightening to present directly to the public. The electromagnetic pulse from a nuclear explosion would destroy electronics and disrupt electrical grids, potentially leaving survivors without power, without communications, without functioning vehicles. The psychological trauma of surviving nuclear attack while knowing that millions have died would be immense. the breakdown of social order as survivors compete for scarce resources, as government authority collapses, as diseases spread through populations weakened by radiation and lacking medical care. The materials present nuclear war as something that can be endured through preparation, but the reality would be far grimmer than the official narrative suggests. Popular culture reflects nuclear anxiety in complex ways. Science fiction films of the 1950s often feature radiation-mutated monsters, giant ants or spiders created by atomic testing. These films allow audiences to process their fears about radiation in symbolic form, turning abstract anxiety into concrete monsters that can be fought and defeated. Other films directly depict nuclear war and its aftermath. On the Beach, released in 1959, portrays the last survivors in Australia waiting for radioactive fallout from a nuclear war in the Northern Hemisphere to reach them and kill them. The film is somber, fatalistic, suggesting that nuclear war means the end of humanity. But there's also a strange normalization of nuclear weapons. In the United States, the mushroom cloud becomes a familiar image, appearing in advertisements, used almost as a joke. Atomic-themed products appear: atomic fireballs candy, atomic coffee. A restaurant chain uses atomic imagery in its branding. Las Vegas hotels host atomic parties where guests watch distant mushroom clouds from nuclear tests. This casual appropriation of nuclear imagery suggests a culture trying to domesticate something terrifying, to make it ordinary and therefore less frightening. In the Soviet Union, nuclear weapons are treated more seriously in public culture, less as advertising gimmicks and more as symbols of state power and scientific achievement. The Soviet government emphasizes its nuclear capability as proof of Soviet equality with the United States, as evidence that socialism can match capitalist technology. The bomb is presented as a defensive weapon, necessary to deter American aggression, to protect the socialist homeland. Soviet propaganda portrays American leaders as warmongering imperialists who would attack the Soviet Union if not deterred by Soviet nuclear weapons. For some people, the nuclear threat leads to political activism. Peace movements emerge in various countries, organizations advocating for nuclear disarmament. These groups organize protests, circulate petitions, publish literature arguing that nuclear weapons must be eliminated. The campaign for nuclear disarmament in Britain adopts a distinctive peace symbol that will become internationally recognized. In the United States, groups like SANE, the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, advocate for an end to atmospheric testing and eventual elimination of nuclear weapons. These movements face government suspicion during the anti-communist era of the 1950s, with activists sometimes accused of being communist sympathizers or agents. Scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project have divided views about the nuclear arms race. Some, like Edward Teller, continue working on weapons development, believing that American security requires nuclear superiority. Others, like J. Robert Oppenheimer, express regrets about their wartime work and advocate for arms control. Oppenheimer's security clearance is revoked in 1954 after a hearing that questions his loyalty and his opposition to the hydrogen bomb program. The Oppenheimer case illustrates the political dangers of questioning nuclear weapons policy during the Cold War. Public opinion polling in the United States shows that most Americans support maintaining a strong nuclear deterrent but also worry about nuclear war. When asked whether they think nuclear war will happen in their lifetimes, significant majorities expect it will. This creates a strange fatalism, a sense that nuclear war is probably inevitable, that it's just a question of when. Some people make life decisions based on this expectation, choosing not to have children, living for the present rather than planning for a future that might not exist. In the Soviet Union, public opinion is harder to gauge since independent polling doesn't exist and public criticism of government policy is dangerous. But private conversations, emigrant accounts, and Soviet literature suggest that Soviet citizens share similar anxieties to their American counterparts. They understand that their cities would be primary targets in any nuclear war. They know that Soviet civil defense, however well organized, could not protect everyone. They hope that deterrence will work, that the mutual threat will prevent war, but they can't be certain. As you rest tonight, think about what it was like to live under this shadow, to raise children in a world where nuclear annihilation was a real possibility, where government pamphlets advised building shelters and stocking supplies as if preparing for a disaster that might destroy civilization. Think about the psychological weight of this threat, carried daily by millions of people who went to work, went to school, lived their lives while knowing that everything could end in minutes if the wrong decision was made or the wrong button pushed. The nuclear standoff wasn't just about weapons and strategy. It was about ordinary people trying to live normal lives under abnormal circumstances. As the nuclear arsenals grew through the 1950s and into the 1960s, a strategic doctrine emerged that would define the nuclear standoff for decades. This doctrine came to be known as mutually assured destruction, often abbreviated as MAD. The concept is both simple and deeply disturbing. You find yourself sitting in a quiet room, listening as strategic planners explain this doctrine in calm, measured tones, describing a logic that keeps nuclear war from happening through the guarantee that such a war would destroy everyone involved. The basic principle of mutually assured destruction is deterrence through the promise of overwhelming retaliation. If either the United States or the Soviet Union launches a nuclear attack against the other, the attacked nation will retain sufficient nuclear forces to launch a devastating counterstrike, even after absorbing the initial attack. This counterstrike would destroy the attacker's cities and kill tens of millions of its citizens. Therefore, no rational leader would launch a first strike because doing so would guarantee their own nation's destruction. Nuclear war becomes, in theory, impossible between rational actors because it cannot be won, only survived in a devastated form. For this doctrine to work, several conditions must be met. First, both sides must have enough nuclear weapons to survive a first strike and still launch an overwhelming retaliation. This is called second strike capability. If one side could destroy all of the other side's nuclear weapons in a surprise first strike, then deterrence would break down. The side with first strike capability might be tempted to attack, believing they could win. Therefore, both sides work to ensure their nuclear forces are survivable. Survivability is achieved through various means. You watch as missiles are placed in hardened underground silos, reinforced concrete structures that can withstand all but a direct hit. Bombers are kept on constant alert, some always in the air, so they cannot be destroyed on the ground. Nuclear submarines are developed, vessels that can hide in the ocean depths for months at a time, each carrying multiple nuclear missiles, virtually undetectable and therefore impossible for an enemy to destroy in a first strike. This triad of land-based missiles, strategic bombers, and submarine-launched missiles ensures that no matter what an enemy does, enough nuclear weapons will survive to launch a devastating counterstrike. The second condition for mutually assured destruction to work is that both sides must believe the other is willing to use nuclear weapons in retaliation. This requires maintaining credibility. Political leaders must convince their adversaries that they truly would order nuclear retaliation if attacked, that they would not hesitate or surrender rather than bring about mutual destruction. This creates a strange psychological game where leaders must appear somewhat irrational, must seem willing to order actions that would doom their own nation in order to deter attack. Command and control systems are developed to ensure that nuclear retaliation can be ordered even if political leadership is killed in a first strike. The United States creates procedures for presidential succession, ensuring that someone with authorization to order nuclear strikes will always survive. Airborne command posts allow military commanders to survive and maintain control of nuclear forces. The Soviet Union developed similar systems. Both sides want their adversaries to know that decapitating their leadership will not prevent retaliation, that the systems are in place to launch nuclear weapons automatically or semi-automatically if necessary. The third condition is that both sides must refrain from developing effective defenses against nuclear weapons. This seems paradoxical. Why wouldn't nations want to defend themselves against nuclear attack? The answer lies in the logic of deterrence. If one side develops an effective defense, such as a system that can shoot down incoming missiles, then that side might feel safe from retaliation. This could make them willing to launch a first strike, believing their defenses would protect them from the counterstrike. Therefore, defenses are viewed as destabilizing, as threatening the balance of mutually assured destruction. This leads to one of the strangest aspects of nuclear strategy. Both sides largely refrain from building extensive civil defenses or anti-missile systems, not because these wouldn't work, but because they might work too well. If one side's population is protected in shelters, if their cities are defended by missile interceptors, the other side might need more weapons to overwhelm those defenses, accelerating the arms race. Or they might fear that the side with good defenses is preparing for first strike. The bizarre result is that both populations remain deliberately vulnerable, undefended against nuclear attack, because this vulnerability is what maintains deterrence. You observe a debate among strategists about the morality of this doctrine. Some argue that mutually assured destruction is the most stable and ethical approach to nuclear weapons. By making nuclear war unwinnable, by ensuring that any use of nuclear weapons would lead to mutual suicide, MAD prevents war. It's a terrible logic, they acknowledge, but it works. Nuclear weapons have not been used since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The doctrine may be based on the threat of mass murder, but it prevents the actualization of that threat. Others find the doctrine deeply immoral. It requires maintaining the permanent threat to murder millions of civilians. It treats entire populations as hostages. It elevates nuclear weapons to a supreme position in defense policy, making conventional military forces almost secondary. Critics argue that there must be better ways to ensure security than through mutual suicide pacts. They point out that the doctrine assumes rationality, but what if a leader is not rational? Or what if there are accidents, misunderstandings, technical failures that trigger war despite no one wanting it? The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which we'll explore in more depth later, tests the assumptions underlying mutually assured destruction. For nearly 2 weeks, the world stands at the edge of nuclear war. The crisis begins when the Soviet Union places nuclear missiles in Cuba within easy striking distance of American cities. President Kennedy orders a naval blockade of Cuba and demands the missiles be removed. Khrushchev refuses initially. Both sides mobilize their forces. Nuclear bombers are prepared for attack. Missile crews stand ready to launch. The world waits to see if the two superpowers will pull back from the brink or plunge into nuclear war. Ultimately, Khrushchev agrees to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American promise not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. The crisis ends without nuclear war. Advocates of mutually assured destruction point to this as evidence that the doctrine works. Neither side used nuclear weapons because both understood it would lead to their own destruction. The logic of MAD held even in an acute crisis. But others note how close the world came to catastrophe. There were moments during the Cuban Missile Crisis when war could have started through accident or miscalculation. A U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. Soviet submarines in the Caribbean were tracked by American destroyers and forced to surface. One Soviet submarine captain considered launching a nuclear torpedo but was talked out of it by his officers. If any of several things had gone slightly differently, nuclear war might have begun despite neither leader wanting it. The crisis suggests that while mutually assured destruction may deter deliberate nuclear war, it may not prevent accidental war. The doctrine of MAD shapes the arms race in specific ways. Since survivability is crucial, both sides invest heavily in systems that can survive a first strike. The number of nuclear weapons grows partly because planners assume that many weapons will be destroyed in a first strike, so you need many more than the minimum required to deter. If you think you need 500 warheads to reach their targets in a retaliatory strike, you might build 5,000 warheads to ensure that 500 survive and successfully launch. Multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, or MIRVs, are developed in the 1970s. These allow a single missile to carry multiple warheads, each aimed at a different target. A single missile might carry 10 nuclear warheads, making missile defense even more difficult and increasing the number of targets that can be struck. MIRVs accelerate the arms race because they multiply the number of warheads without increasing the number of missiles, making it harder to count and verify arsenals in any arms control agreement. The doctrine also affects conventional military planning. In Europe, where NATO and Warsaw Pact forces face each other across the Iron Curtain, both sides deploy tactical nuclear weapons, smaller nukes designed for battlefield use. The idea is that if conventional defense fails, tactical nuclear weapons might stop a Soviet advance or a NATO counterattack. But strategists worry about escalation. If tactical nuclear weapons are used, will the war remain limited or will it escalate to strategic nuclear strikes on cities? No one knows, and no one wants to find out. As you lie here tonight, contemplating this strange logic of mutually assured destruction, consider what an unusual situation humanity had created for itself. Two nations possessed the power to destroy human civilization, and they maintained that power deliberately, threatened to use it, but never actually used it precisely because using it would be suicidal. The weapons existed to never be used. Their purpose was their non-use. It was a balance maintained through fear, through rationality, through the hope that accidents wouldn't happen and that leaders would remain sane. For decades, this logic held. But it required continuous maintenance, constant vigilance, and a level of trust that neither side quite had in the other. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 represents the moment when the nuclear standoff came closest to erupting into actual war. For 13 days, you watch as the world holds its breath, as the United States and the Soviet Union move toward confrontation, as the mechanisms of deterrence and communication strain under pressure. This crisis will later be viewed as the peak of Cold War nuclear danger, the closest humanity has come to nuclear war, and also as a turning point that leads both superpowers to step back from the brink and seek ways to manage their rivalry more carefully. The crisis has its roots in events of previous years. In 1959, Fidel Castro leads a revolution that overthrows the Cuban government. Initially, Castro is not clearly communist, but American hostility pushes him toward the Soviet Union. In April 1961, the United States supports an invasion of Cuba by anti-Castro exiles at the Bay of Pigs. The invasion fails completely, embarrassing the Kennedy administration and convincing Castro that he needs Soviet protection. Through 1961 and 1962, Cuba and the Soviet Union grow closer. Soviet economic and military aid flows to Cuba. In spring 1962, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev decides to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. The decision is driven by several factors. The Soviet Union is falling behind in the arms race, particularly in intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach American targets from Soviet territory. Placing missiles in Cuba would help offset American numerical superiority by putting Soviet nuclear weapons within easy range of American cities. The missiles would protect Cuba from another American invasion, and the placement might be used as leverage to pressure the United States to remove its missiles from Turkey, which are close to Soviet borders. Khrushchev believes he can install the missiles secretly and then present the Americans with a fait accompli they'll have to accept. Through summer 1962, Soviet ships carry missiles, launchers, and nuclear warheads to Cuba. The operation is conducted with great secrecy. The missiles are transported at night, covered with tarps, hidden from aerial surveillance. Soviet military personnel arrive in Cuba disguised as civilians or agricultural advisors. Construction of missile sites begins in remote areas, camouflaged to avoid detection. By September, medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missile sites are under construction, along with installations for cruise missiles, bombers, and other military equipment. American intelligence begins picking up indications that something unusual is happening in Cuba. Reports from Cuban refugees mention large cylindrical objects being transported on trucks, construction at military sites, increased Soviet personnel. U-2 spy planes fly over Cuba regularly, photographing suspected military installations. On October 14th, a U-2 flight captures photographs of a missile site under construction. Photo interpreters study the images and identify the distinctive pattern of a medium-range ballistic missile installation, similar to Soviet sites that have been photographed in the Soviet Union. The next morning, October 15th, you're in the White House as President Kennedy is informed that Soviet missiles are being installed in Cuba. Kennedy immediately understands the implications. These missiles can reach Washington, New York, and most of the eastern United States within minutes. They significantly alter the strategic balance, making America vulnerable to nuclear attack with virtually no warning time. Kennedy faces a critical decision about how to respond. Over the next week, Kennedy meets repeatedly with a group of advisors that becomes known as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. The meetings are intense, with different advisors advocating different responses. Some, particularly military leaders, advocate for immediate airstrikes to destroy the missile sites before they become operational. Others propose a full invasion of Cuba to remove Castro and the Soviet presence entirely. More cautious voices argue for diplomatic approaches, warning that military action could trigger Soviet retaliation and escalate to nuclear war. Kennedy ultimately chooses a middle course. On the evening of October 22nd, he addresses the nation on television, revealing the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba and announcing a naval quarantine of Cuba. American ships will stop and search vessels heading to Cuba, turning back any carrying offensive weapons. The word quarantine is chosen instead of blockade because a blockade is technically an act of war. Kennedy demands that the Soviet Union remove the missiles and warns that any nuclear attack from Cuba will be met with full retaliation against the Soviet Union. You watch the speech with millions of Americans, seeing Kennedy's serious demeanor, hearing the gravity in his voice. The president is telling the nation that it faces a direct nuclear threat, that the next days will be crucial. After the speech, there's an eerie calm, a sense of waiting. What will Khrushchev do? Will Soviet ships challenge the quarantine? Will Khrushchev remove the missiles or refuse? Will there be war? In Moscow, Khrushchev receives Kennedy's speech with alarm and anger. He feels the Americans have no right to dictate what weapons Cuba, a sovereign nation, can possess. He knows that backing down will be humiliating, will make him appear weak both internationally and within the Soviet leadership. But he also understands that if Soviet ships try to run the quarantine, if they're stopped or fired upon, the situation could escalate rapidly to nuclear war. He's playing a dangerous game of brinkmanship, trying to intimidate Kennedy into backing down while avoiding actual war. The next several days are extraordinarily tense. Soviet ships approach the quarantine line. American warships prepare to intercept them. The world waits to see if there will be a confrontation at sea. Then, on October 24th, the Soviet ships stop before reaching the quarantine line. They're holding position, waiting for instructions from Moscow. Secretary of State Dean Rusk famously remarks, "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." But the crisis is far from over. The missile sites in Cuba continue being constructed rapidly. American intelligence estimates they'll be operational within days. Kennedy faces pressure from military advisors to launch air strikes before the missiles become operational. The Strategic Air Command is raised to DEFCON 2, the highest state of readiness short of actual war. Nuclear bombers are in the air around the clock. Missile crews stand ready to launch. Soviet forces are similarly mobilized. Both sides are preparing for nuclear war while hoping it can be avoided. Khrushchev sends a letter to Kennedy on October 26th, a long, emotional message suggesting a deal. If Kennedy promises not to invade Cuba, Khrushchev will remove the missiles. The letter seems to offer a way out of the crisis. But before Kennedy can respond, a second letter arrives on October 27th, this one with different terms. Now Khrushchev demands that the United States remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey in exchange for removing Soviet missiles from Cuba. This complicates the situation. The missiles in Turkey are under NATO control, and removing them would require consultations with allies. That same day, October 27th, several incidents make the crisis even more dangerous. A U-2 spy plane is shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, killing the pilot. This could be seen as an act of war, justifying American retaliation. An American U-2 accidentally strays into Soviet airspace over Siberia, causing Soviet fighters to scramble and American fighters to respond. The incident is accidental, but at this moment of high tension, it could be misinterpreted. Most dangerous, although not known until years later, is an incident in the Caribbean. American destroyers are tracking Soviet submarines, forcing them to surface by dropping practice depth charges. One Soviet submarine, unable to surface, suffering from heat and carbon dioxide buildup, loses contact with Moscow, and being targeted by depth charges, considers launching a nuclear torpedo at the American ships. The submarine captain and political officer favor launching. Only the intervention of a third officer, the flotilla commander who happens to be aboard, prevents the launch. If that nuclear torpedo had been fired, it would likely have triggered nuclear war. But Kennedy and Khrushchev know nothing of this near catastrophe at the time. Kennedy and his advisors decide to respond to Khrushchev's first letter while ignoring the second. Kennedy publicly promises not to invade Cuba if the missiles are removed. Privately, through back channels, he lets Khrushchev know that the missiles in Turkey will be removed, though not immediately and not as a public trade. This gives Khrushchev a way to back down while claiming victory, saying he's protected Cuba from invasion and gotten American missiles removed from Turkey. On October 28th, Khrushchev announces that the missiles in Cuba will be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union. The crisis is over. Relief sweeps across both nations and around the world. Nuclear war has been avoided. The mechanisms of deterrence have held. Both leaders have shown restraint and rationality at the crucial moment. In the aftermath, both Kennedy and Khrushchev claim victory. Kennedy is seen as having forced Soviet retreat, as having stood firm and made Khrushchev back down. His approval ratings soar. But privately, Kennedy is shaken by how close the world came to nuclear war, how many points there were where accident or miscalculation could have started a war neither leader wanted. He begins seeking ways to reduce nuclear tensions, to create better communication with the Soviet Union. Khrushchev faces criticism within Soviet leadership for backing down. The humiliation of removing the missiles contributes to his removal from power 2 years later. But Khrushchev also recognizes how dangerous the crisis was. He agrees to establish better communication channels with Washington. In June 1963, a direct communication link, the famous hotline, is established between the White House and the Kremlin. It's not actually a telephone but a teletype system, allowing rapid written communication during crises. The hope is that better communication will prevent future misunderstandings that could lead to war. The Cuban Missile Crisis has lasting effects on nuclear strategy and arms control. Both sides recognized that coming so close to nuclear war was extremely dangerous, that the world cannot afford another such crisis. This recognition leads to the first significant arms control agreement, the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which bans nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. Testing can continue underground, but the treaty reduces radioactive fallout and begins the process of arms control cooperation. As you reflect on these 13 days in October 1962, consider how the fate of human civilization hung on decisions made by two men under enormous pressure, with imperfect information, with advisors urging different courses of action. Consider how close we came to nuclear war through a combination of miscalculation, brinkmanship, and accident. The Cuban Missile Crisis shows both that deterrence can work, that rational leaders will pull back from the brink, but also that the system is not foolproof, that accidents and misunderstandings can bring the world to the edge of catastrophe. The crisis passed, and humanity survived, but the memory of how close we came would influence nuclear policy for decades. The development of nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines represents one of the most significant technological achievements of the Cold War and one of the most destabilizing, or perhaps stabilizing, depending on perspective, additions to the nuclear arsenals. You find yourself learning about these vessels, underwater boats that can hide in the ocean depths for months at a time, each carrying enough nuclear firepower to destroy multiple cities, virtually undetectable, moving silently through the dark ocean, a component of the nuclear triad that ensures the survivability of second strike capability. Submarines have been used in warfare since the early 20th century, but they were limited by the need to surface frequently to run diesel engines and recharge batteries. A submarine running on batteries underwater could only stay submerged for hours or at most days before needing to surface. This made submarines detectable and vulnerable. The development of nuclear power changes everything. A nuclear reactor can run for years without refueling, producing electricity to power the submarine's motors, to generate oxygen from seawater, to purify water, to maintain livable conditions for the crew. A nuclear-powered submarine can stay underwater for months at a time, limited only by the food supply and the crew's psychological endurance. The United States launches the first nuclear-powered submarine, USS Nautilus, in 1954. This vessel demonstrates the viability of nuclear propulsion for submarines. The Nautilus can travel underwater at high speeds for unlimited distances, can cross the Atlantic without surfacing, can even travel under the Arctic ice cap. The implications for warfare are immediately clear. A nuclear submarine can lurk near enemy coasts, can hide in deep ocean basins, can evade detection and destruction. The next step is combining nuclear propulsion with ballistic missiles. If a submarine can stay submerged indefinitely and can carry nuclear missiles, it becomes a mobile, hidden launch platform that the enemy cannot target. The first American ballistic missile submarine, USS George Washington, is commissioned in 1959. It carries 16 Paul Ares missiles, each with a nuclear warhead, each capable of hitting targets more than 1,000 miles away. The submarine can patrol off enemy coasts, remaining submerged, and if ordered, can surface briefly to launch its missiles and then submerge again. You go aboard one of these submarines in the 1960s, observing the conditions in which the crew lives and works. The submarine is cramped, with narrow passageways, stacked bunks for sleeping, limited space for any activity beyond essential duties. The crew of perhaps 150 men will spend 2 months or more underwater without seeing daylight, without fresh air, without any contact with their families. The air is recycled, filtered, maintained at breathable quality by machinery. Food is prepared in tiny galleys and eaten in shifts. Privacy is almost non-existent. The mission is one of deterrence through invisibility. The submarine's location is kept secret even from most of the crew. Only the captain and a few senior officers know exactly where they are. The submarine maintains radio silence, listening for orders but not transmitting, remaining undetectable. If nuclear war breaks out, if the submarine receives authenticated orders to launch its missiles, the crew will carry out those orders, firing 16 nuclear weapons at targets that could be thousands of miles away. The crew trains constantly for this moment, practicing launch procedures, maintaining the missiles, ensuring readiness. The Soviet Union develops its own ballistic missile submarines, though initially they're noisier and easier to detect than American submarines. Soviet submarines suffer from less advanced manufacturing techniques, from reactors that make more noise, from designs that create more hydrodynamic drag. American submarines and anti-submarine aircraft can track Soviet submarines more easily than the Soviets can track American submarines. This creates an asymmetry that worries Soviet planners. If American submarines are harder to find, they're more survivable, giving America a more secure second strike capability. Both nations invest heavily in anti-submarine warfare, in technologies to detect and track enemy submarines. Hydrophone arrays are placed on the ocean floor, listening for the sounds of submarine machinery. Patrol aircraft equipped with magnetic detectors and sonar buoys search for submarines. Attack submarines are designed to hunt other submarines. But the ocean is vast, and a quiet submarine running deep is extraordinarily difficult to find. As technology improves, submarines become quieter, deeper diving, more capable. By the 1970s and 1980s, both sides have fleets of ballistic missile submarines, each vessel carrying 8 or 16 or even 24 missiles, each missile with multiple warheads. The submarines create a permanent, invulnerable deterrent. Even if every land-based missile and bomber is destroyed in a surprise first strike, the submarines survive, hidden in the ocean, ready to launch their missiles in retaliation. This makes the idea of a successful first strike essentially impossible. No matter what, enough nuclear weapons will survive to devastate the attacker. The submarines are the ultimate guarantee of mutually assured destruction. But submarines also create new fears. Because submarines are so hard to find, because their locations are unknown, there's always uncertainty about how close enemy submarines might be to your coasts. American ballistic missile submarines patrol in the Atlantic and Pacific, positioned to strike Soviet targets. Soviet submarines patrol near American coasts, their missiles able to reach Washington or New York with only minutes of flight time. This reduces warning time in case of attack, creating pressure for quick decisions if attack is detected, increasing the risk of miscalculation or accident. The submarine force becomes a prestigious assignment in both navies. Submarine crews are carefully selected, extensively trained, psychologically screened. The men who serve on ballistic missile submarines know they carry enormous responsibility. They're entrusted with weapons that could kill millions. They must be ready to launch on order without hesitation, but they must never launch without proper authorization. The command and control systems are designed with multiple redundancies, requiring several officers to agree and to authenticate orders before missiles can be launched. You spend time with a submariner, listening to his description of months underwater, the routine that becomes hypnotic, the drills that are practiced until they're automatic, the awareness that always lurks in the back of his mind that he's part of a system designed to end the world if necessary. He describes the moment of surfacing after a long patrol, the hatch opening, fresh air flooding in, sunlight, the immense relief of having completed the mission without having to launch. Most submariners serve entire careers without ever launching a ballistic missile except in tests. They train constantly for a mission they hope never to execute. The submarines also enable new strategic concepts. The assured second strike they provide allows both sides to move away from launch on warning postures, from the idea that missiles must be launched immediately upon detecting attack lest they be destroyed. With submarines guaranteeing retaliation, leaders can afford to wait, to verify that an attack is actually occurring rather than reacting to false alarms. This makes the system somewhat more stable, less likely to trigger accidental nuclear war due to sensor errors or misinterpretations. But submarines are not perfect guarantors of stability. There are incidents where Soviet submarines are tracked by American forces, where cat-and-mouse games occur underwater, where submarines of both sides come close to collision. There are technological failures, fires aboard submarines, reactor accidents, incidents where submarines sink and are lost with their crews. The ocean is an unforgiving environment, and operating nuclear reactors and missiles underwater is inherently dangerous. Each nation loses submarines over the years, though the details remain classified. The submarine force represents an enormous investment. Building nuclear submarines is expensive, requiring advanced metallurgy, sophisticated electronics, nuclear reactors, precision manufacturing. Maintaining them is equally expensive, requiring specialized facilities, trained technicians, supply chains for unique components. By the 1980s, both nations maintained fleets of dozens of ballistic missile submarines, each costing hundreds of millions of dollars, representing a significant portion of defense budgets. As you rest tonight, think about these submarines, hidden in ocean depths all around the world, each carrying enough destructive power to end millions of lives, each crewed by men who have volunteered for this lonely, dangerous duty. The submarines represent both the ultimate in deterrence, ensuring that nuclear war cannot be won, and the ultimate in danger, placing enormous destructive power in mobile platforms that could trigger catastrophe through accident or miscommunication. They're part of the complex, dangerous balance that kept nuclear war from happening, but they're also a reminder of how much destructive power humanity had created and how carefully it had to be managed to prevent catastrophe. The Cuban Missile Crisis marks a turning point in the nuclear standoff. After coming so close to nuclear war, both the United States and the Soviet Union recognized that they need better ways to manage their rivalry, to communicate during crises, to limit the nuclear arms race that has been accelerating since the 1940s. You find yourself observing the slow, difficult process of arms control negotiations, watching as two adversaries who deeply mistrust each other try to find common ground, to place limits on their weapons while maintaining security. The first significant step comes quickly after the Cuban Missile Crisis. In June 1963, less than a year after the crisis, President Kennedy gives a speech at American University calling for a re-examination of Cold War attitudes. He speaks about the need to reduce nuclear dangers, to find ways to coexist with the Soviet Union without threatening mutual annihilation. The speech is well received in Moscow, where Khrushchev sees it as an opening for negotiations. Later that summer, the United States, Soviet Union, and Britain signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty. The treaty prohibits nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. Underground testing is still permitted, but the treaty significantly reduces radioactive fallout that has been contaminating the environment from atmospheric tests. The treaty is not a disarmament measure. It doesn't reduce the number of nuclear weapons. But it's a first step, a demonstration that the superpowers can reach agreements on nuclear matters, that arms control is possible. The Limited Test Ban Treaty is partly motivated by growing public concern about radioactive fallout from atmospheric testing. Scientists have documented how radioactive particles from tests circulate through the atmosphere, falling to Earth around the world, contaminating soil and water, entering the food chain. Strontium-90, a radioactive isotope produced by nuclear fission, is chemically similar to calcium and accumulates in bones and teeth. Studies show increasing levels of strontium-90 in children's teeth, clear evidence that fallout from tests is affecting populations far from test sites. The treaty responds to these concerns, moving tests underground where fallout is contained. France and China, who are developing their own nuclear weapons, refuse to sign the Limited Test Ban Treaty. France conducts atmospheric tests in the Pacific through the 1960s and into the 1970s. China conducts its first nuclear test in 1964, becoming the fifth nuclear weapon state, followed by its first hydrogen bomb test in 1967. The nuclear club is expanding despite arms control efforts. By the end of the 1960s, 5 nations possess nuclear weapons, and others are pursuing them. To prevent further proliferation, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is negotiated in the late 1960s. The treaty, which opens for signature in 1968, establishes a bargain. Non-nuclear weapon states agree not to develop or acquire nuclear weapons. In exchange, the nuclear weapon states agree to share peaceful nuclear technology and to pursue nuclear disarmament. The treaty recognizes 5 nations as nuclear weapon states: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China. All other nations are categorized as non-nuclear weapon states and are prohibited from developing nuclear weapons. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is controversial. Some nations view it as discriminatory, enshrining the privileges of existing nuclear powers while denying others the same capability. India in particular objects to the treaty, arguing that it creates nuclear haves and have-nots. India eventually develops nuclear weapons outside the treaty framework, conducting its first nuclear test in 1974. Pakistan follows with its own nuclear weapons program, as does Israel, though Israel maintains a policy of nuclear ambiguity, never officially confirming its possession of nuclear weapons. Despite these exceptions, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is successful in limiting the number of nuclear-armed states. Many nations that had nuclear weapons programs abandoned them and signed the treaty. The most substantive arms control negotiations focus on limiting the strategic nuclear arsenals of the United States and Soviet Union. These negotiations, known as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks or SALT, begin in 1969 and continue through the 1970s. The talks are extraordinarily complex, involving technical experts who debate the details of missile ranges, warhead yields, verification methods. Both sides approach the talks with suspicion, each trying to gain advantage while limiting the other. The first agreement, SALT-I, is signed in 1972 by President Nixon and Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, who has replaced Khrushchev as Soviet leader. SALT-I includes 2 main components. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty limits defensive systems, allowing each side to deploy only limited missile defenses. This reflects the mutually assured destruction logic that defenses are destabilizing. If one side can defend itself against retaliation, it might be more willing to launch a first strike. By limiting defenses, the treaty maintains mutual vulnerability and therefore deterrence. The second component is the Interim Agreement on Strategic Offensive Arms, which freezes the number of strategic ballistic missile launchers at existing levels for 5 years. The agreement doesn't reduce weapons, but at least stops the number of launchers from increasing. SALT-I is significant as the first agreement limiting strategic nuclear arms, but it has limitations. It doesn't limit bombers or the number of warheads on missiles, only the number of launchers. This allows both sides to develop multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, or MIRVs, placing multiple warheads on each missile. So while the number of missiles is frozen, the number of warheads continues growing. By the late 1970s, both sides have thousands more warheads than they had when SALT-I was signed. Negotiations for a follow-on agreement, SALT-II, begin almost immediately after SALT-I and continue through the 1970s. SALT-II is more comprehensive, setting limits on the total number of strategic nuclear delivery vehicles including missiles and bombers, and placing some limits on MIRVs. The treaty is signed in 1979 by President Carter and Brezhnev, but it's never ratified by the United States Senate. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 creates political opposition to the treaty. Critics argue that the Soviet Union cannot be trusted, that arms control with a nation invading its neighbors is impossible. Though SALT-II is never ratified, both sides generally observe its limits voluntarily. Verification is a constant challenge in arms control. Neither side trusts the other to comply with agreements without verification. The phrase "trust but verify" becomes associated with arms control negotiations. Verification relies primarily on satellites, which can photograph missile sites, count launches, monitor construction of new facilities. Both sides develop sophisticated reconnaissance satellites specifically for monitoring arms control compliance. On-site inspections, where each side can send observers to the other's territory to verify compliance, are proposed but initially resisted by the Soviets, who are obsessed with secrecy. You sit in on verification discussions where intelligence analysts pore over satellite photographs, counting missile silos, measuring missile dimensions, trying to determine capabilities. The analysts develop techniques to measure missiles from shadows in photographs, to identify construction materials from spectral analysis, to track missile tests using early warning satellites. This national technical means of verification makes arms control agreements possible, giving each side confidence that the other is complying, or at least that violations will be detected. Arms control is not disarmament. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, even as treaties are negotiated and signed, both sides continue modernizing their arsenals, developing more accurate missiles, deploying new submarine-launched missiles, building new bombers. The arms race continues within the constraints of arms control agreements. Both sides are trying to gain advantage while managing the most dangerous aspects of nuclear competition. Public opinion in both nations supports arms control efforts but also wants strong defense. Peace movements advocate for more aggressive disarmament, for unilateral reductions, for nuclear freeze proposals that would halt all nuclear weapons production and testing. Some of these proposals gain significant public support. In the early 1980s, millions of people in Europe and America participate in nuclear freeze demonstrations, demanding that governments stop building new nuclear weapons. But governments in both nations resist these proposals, arguing that strength is necessary for successful arms control, that negotiating from weakness invites exploitation. The process of arms control teaches both sides about each other, creates channels of communication, builds institutional relationships between American and Soviet officials who meet repeatedly over years of negotiations. These relationships become valuable during crises, providing back channels for communication, creating personal connections that transcend ideological differences. Negotiators on both sides develop respect for their counterparts, recognize that the other side has legitimate security concerns, come to see arms control as a shared interest in preventing nuclear war. As you rest tonight, consider the slow, difficult work of arms control, the patient negotiations over technical details, the attempt to limit weapons while maintaining security. Arms control was never popular with everyone. Hawks in both nations viewed it as weakness, as naively trusting the enemy. Peace activists viewed it as insufficient, as managing the arms race rather than ending it. But arms control represented an acknowledgement by both superpowers that the nuclear standoff had to be managed carefully, that unlimited nuclear competition served neither side's interests, that the risk of nuclear war had to be reduced through cooperation even between adversaries. The 1980s bring the final phase of the Cold War nuclear standoff and, surprisingly, its peaceful resolution. You find yourself watching as the dynamic that has defined international relations for 4 decades begins to shift, as new leaders emerge with different approaches, as economic pressures force reconsiderations of military spending, as the nuclear arms race that seemed endless finally begins to wind down. The decade begins tensely. Ronald Reagan becomes President of the United States in 1981 with a confrontational approach toward the Soviet Union. He calls it an evil empire, increases defense spending dramatically, announces new weapons programs including the Strategic Defense Initiative, popularly called Star Wars, a proposed space-based system to shoot down incoming missiles. The Strategic Defense Initiative is controversial. Supporters argue it would make nuclear weapons obsolete by providing effective defense. Critics argue it's technically infeasible, that it would cost hundreds of billions of dollars, that it would destabilize deterrence by making one side feel safe from retaliation. The Soviet Union vehemently opposes SDI, seeing it as an attempt to achieve nuclear superiority. The early 1980s see increased tensions. The Soviet Union deploys SS-20 intermediate-range missiles in Eastern Europe, threatening Western European cities. NATO responds by deploying American Pershing II and cruise missiles in Western Europe, bringing nuclear weapons even closer to Soviet territory. This triggers massive peace demonstrations across Europe. Millions protest the deployment of new missiles, fearing that Europe is becoming a nuclear battleground. The protests don't stop the deployments, but they reflect widespread public anxiety about nuclear war. In 1983, tensions reached dangerous levels. A Soviet fighter shoots down Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian airliner that strays into Soviet airspace, killing all aboard including a US congressman. The incident is accidental, the result of navigational errors and poor communication, but it inflames US-Soviet relations. Later that year, a NATO military exercise called Able Archer nearly triggers a nuclear crisis. Soviet intelligence misinterprets the exercise as preparation for actual attack. The Soviet military goes on high alert, readying nuclear forces. The crisis passes when the exercise ends without attack, but analysts later realize how close the world came to war through misunderstanding. But change is coming from within the Soviet Union. The Soviet economy is stagnating, burdened by massive military spending, inefficient planning, technological backwardness. Soviet leaders through the early 1980s are old, ill men who die in office. Brezhnev dies in 1982. His successor Yuri Andropov dies in 1984. Konstantin Chernenko dies in 1985. When Mikhail Gorbachev becomes Soviet leader in March 1985, he represents a new generation. At 54, Gorbachev is young by Soviet standards, educated, pragmatic, aware that the Soviet system is failing. Gorbachev introduces reforms he calls glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. He allows more freedom of speech, permits criticism of government, begins economic reforms to introduce market mechanisms. These reforms are meant to revitalize Soviet socialism, but they unleash forces that Gorbachev cannot control. The more freedom people have to speak, the more they criticize the system. The more the economy is reformed, the clearer it becomes that fundamental change is necessary. In foreign policy, Gorbachev pursues what he calls new thinking. He recognizes that the Soviet Union cannot afford to continue the arms race, that competition with the United States is bankrupting the country. He genuinely wants to reduce nuclear weapons, to end the Cold War, to integrate the Soviet Union into the global economy. Reagan, despite his earlier confrontational rhetoric, proves willing to negotiate. The two leaders meet at Geneva in 1985, beginning a series of summits that will transform US-Soviet relations. The negotiations focus on reducing nuclear weapons, not just limiting their growth as previous arms control had done, but actually reducing the arsenals. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in 1987, eliminates an entire class of nuclear weapons, the intermediate and shorter-range missiles deployed in Europe. For the first time, nuclear weapons are not just limited but eliminated. The treaty includes unprecedented verification provisions, allowing on-site inspections where each side can send teams to the other's territory to verify that missiles are being destroyed. You watch as American and Soviet inspectors witness the destruction of missiles. The missiles are cut apart, their components smashed, verified as destroyed according to treaty protocols. It's a powerful symbol, the undoing of part of the nuclear buildup, the beginning of actual disarmament. The treaty is possible partly because these weapons are less central to both sides' strategic arsenals than intercontinental missiles and bombers, but it's still significant as proof that reductions are possible. Negotiations continue on reducing strategic nuclear weapons, the intercontinental missiles and submarine-launched missiles and bombers that form the core of both arsenals. The Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START, is more ambitious than previous agreements. It will actually reduce the number of strategic warheads deployed by both sides. The negotiations are complex, involving arguments over counting rules, over what types of weapons to include, over verification methods. But both sides persist, recognizing that reducing arsenals serves mutual interests. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union is transforming in ways that go far beyond arms control. Gorbachev's reforms are destabilizing the entire Soviet system. In Eastern Europe, communist governments are losing their grip. Poland's Solidarity movement challenges communist rule. Hungary opens its border with Austria, creating a hole in the Iron Curtain. In East Germany, people begin demanding freedom to travel, to speak, to choose their government. Gorbachev, unlike previous Soviet leaders, decides not to use force to maintain communist rule in Eastern Europe. He tells Eastern European leaders they're on their own, that Soviet troops will not intervene to save them. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. The barrier that has divided the city since 1961, that has symbolized the Cold War division of Europe, is breached by ordinary people with hammers and pickaxes. East Germans flood into West Berlin. Families separated for decades reunite. The Cold War's most visible symbol crumbles. Within a year, Germany will reunify. The Warsaw Pact will dissolve. Communist governments throughout Eastern Europe will fall, replaced by democratic governments. The Soviet Union itself is disintegrating. The Baltic republics declare independence. Other republics follow. The Communist Party loses its monopoly on power. In August 1991, hardliners attempt a coup against Gorbachev, trying to preserve the Soviet system. The coup fails, but it fatally weakens Gorbachev's authority. In December 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolves. The 15 Soviet republics become independent nations. Russia, led by Boris Yeltsin, inherits most of the Soviet nuclear arsenal and most of Soviet territory, but the Soviet Union as an entity ceases to exist. The Cold War is over. The nuclear standoff that defined international relations for 4.5 decades has ended, not through war but through the peaceful collapse of one of the adversaries. The United States is now the sole superpower. The ideological competition between capitalism and communism has ended with capitalism's victory. The fear of nuclear war that shadowed a generation is lifting. In the 1990s, nuclear arsenals are reduced significantly. The START Treaty is ratified, followed by START 2, which calls for even deeper cuts. Both the United States and Russia reduce their strategic arsenals to a fraction of Cold War peaks. nuclear weapons are withdrawn from various deployment areas. The hair trigger alert status is relaxed. The constant readiness for instant nuclear war is reduced. While thousands of nuclear weapons remain, the sense of imminent nuclear danger fades. But nuclear weapons don't disappear. Russia maintains a large nuclear arsenal. The United States maintains a large arsenal. Britain, France, and China retain their nuclear weapons. India and Pakistan both conduct nuclear tests in 1998, openly declaring themselves nuclear powers. North Korea develops nuclear weapons in the 2000s. The proliferation problem persists. Nuclear weapons remain a global concern, but the specific dynamic of the US-Soviet standoff, the particular danger of two superpowers with tens of thousands of weapons pointed at each other, has ended. The legacy of the nuclear standoff is complex. For 4.5 decades, humanity lived under the threat of nuclear annihilation. The weapons were never used in war after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a remarkable fact given the tensions and crises. Whether this restraint was due to deterrence, to luck, to moral revulsion, or to some combination of these factors continues to be debated. Nuclear weapons shaped military strategy, diplomatic relations, domestic politics, culture, psychology. An entire generation grew up with the knowledge that everything could end in nuclear war. The environmental legacy is significant. Nuclear testing contaminated vast areas. The Nevada test site, the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan, the Pacific atolls used for tests, all remain contaminated by radioactivity. People who live downwind of test sites have higher cancer rates. Veterans exposed to radiation during tests suffer health problems. The production of nuclear materials contaminated sites around both nations. Hanford in Washington State, Rocky Flats in Colorado, Chelyabinsk in Russia, these places remain contaminated, requiring cleanup that will take decades and cost billions. But humanity also learned from the nuclear standoff. The experience taught the importance of arms control, of verification, of crisis communication, of managing competition between adversaries. The hotline established after the Cuban Missile Crisis has been used in subsequent crises to prevent misunderstanding. The arms control treaties developed verification methods that are applied to other international agreements. The recognition that some problems require international cooperation, that some dangers threaten everyone regardless of ideology, emerged partly from the nuclear experience. As you lie here tonight, in the quiet darkness, let yourself feel the relief that this particular danger has receded. The nuclear standoff between the United States and Soviet Union dominated the second half of the 20th century. It shaped the world you inherited. The weapons still exist. The danger is not entirely gone. But the acute crisis, the sense that nuclear war could happen at any moment, has faded. Humanity came through the nuclear standoff without using these weapons in war after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's worth remembering and being grateful for. Think about the people who lived through those decades, who built shelters, who feared for their children's future, who participated in protest movements or arms control negotiations, who served on nuclear submarines or in missile silos, all part of this vast, dangerous standoff. Think about the scientists who developed nuclear weapons and who, many of them, spent the rest of their lives advocating for their elimination. Think about the leaders who faced nuclear crises and who, despite pressure and fear, chose restraint over escalation. Think about ordinary people who lived normal lives under abnormal circumstances, who went to school and to work and raised families while knowing that everything could end. The atomic standoff is part of our history now, a period that seems almost incomprehensible in its danger, in its brinkmanship, in the casual way both sides talked about weapons that could end civilization. We are fortunate it ended as it did, peacefully, through economic and political transformation rather than through war. The lesson may be that even the most intractable conflicts can be resolved without violence, that even the deepest rivalries can end, that change is possible even when it seems impossible. Let these thoughts settle gently as you drift towards sleep. The nuclear standoff is over. The Cold War has ended. The immediate danger has passed. Tomorrow the sun will rise on a world that still has many problems, many challenges, but not this particular danger, not this specific threat that defined so many lives for so many years. Rest now in the knowledge that one of history's greatest dangers was navigated successfully, that humanity survived its encounter with nuclear weapons during the Cold War, and that we can learn from that experience as we face the challenges of our own time. Sleep peacefully, knowing that this chapter of history is closed, that the long atomic standoff has ended, and that we are here, still here, to remember and to learn. Good night.